I I always think a lot about how to start a talk. Like the way you start kind of determines whether you've got people or not for the next 20 minutes. Like first impressions really matter. Same with meeting people. I'm not very good with meeting people and first impressions, partly because I'm not very good at remembering names. I'm dyslexic, which is my catch-all excuse for anything I want it to excuse me from. And I'm just not quite good at, and there's a lot of pressure, isn't there, to remember names and get them right. At work, at school, or at church even. Sandy Miller, a pastor in the UK, used to say, nobody expects you to remember everybody's name, just theirs. Which I think is very true. I had a really awkward moment this week where I was at an important engagement, kind of official engagement, and I was greeted at the door by the man in whose honor this event was. And so I was very formal. I greeted him and said, my name's Reverend Daniel Millest. I'm a part of the team here at HTBB. And he interrupted me and said, I know, we've met before. And I'm just dying inside. I'm like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I've done this again. I don't remember him at all, and I do what we all do, and I go, oh yes, I'm so sorry, how good to see you again, and then walked off saying to Kate, just like, oh my goodness, I can't believe I've done that, I just don't remember him, I feel so bad. Turns out he'd met Miles, not me, so I guess we all do make these mistakes. First impressions are really important. And they're important because in that moment, you kind of make a judgment about somebody, and then you view them through that lens going forwards. Companies know this. You have to get your brand launch right. A bad brand launch can scupper an otherwise brilliant product. A first impression is taken to be kind of a summation of the whole, and it's through that we kind of judge and kind of see whether or not we're going to engage with that person. In our reading today, we're going to see two first impressions. First one is going to be a young married couple making their first impression as they step out on their wedding day. And the second one is of Jesus as he steps out in his public ministry. And we're going to learn something from each of them. From the young married couple, we're going to learn that we don't always get things right. And from Jesus, we're going to learn, we'll come to it. As Miles said, we're starting our series in John's Gospel today. John's Gospel was written by John, and he was an eyewitness to Jesus' life. He was one of his closest friends. He spent 3 years traveling with him, and he writes the Gospel of John, which is kind of about the life of Jesus with his glory kind of hidden. And then he writes the book of Revelation, the revelation of Jesus, which is all about Jesus and his glory revealed. But at the end of John, he tells us why he wrote this book down. And what he says, look, Jesus did loads of stuff. And he said, if I tried to write it all down, there would not be books enough in the whole world. And then he says, but I've written this down that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. If you've ever found yourself asking the question, is this it? Is there more to life than this? Will I ever be content? Why do I struggle to be me? Or any of those questions. John says the answer can be found in the pages of his books. And the answer is Jesus. And that in believing in him, in knowing him, you will have life. This isn't just an intellectual exercise, but this is something that flows out into your life every day, 9 to 5, at home and at work, everything. Often on Alpha, people will say things like, I'd love to have faith. I'd love to believe. And it's great that God has made himself known to you. But why doesn't he just make himself known to me? And John's answer is that he has. John's answer is that 2,000 years ago, God came in the person of Jesus Christ and made himself known. That God became flesh and moved into the condo, and that we saw him and we got to know him, and that he is available through the witness of the church, through the sacraments, through reading of the word. We can get to know him too and have life in abundance. And then John, what he does, he gives us 7 signs. What he does, he says, Jesus does loads of miracles, but he gives us 7 of them. And he calls them signs and wonders rather than miracles. And it's because they're not just nice tricks. These are signs that point to the point to make us wonder. And each sign is designed to take us to a crisis point, a point where you have to decide, where you have to go, either Jesus was who he said he was, and I'm going to worship him as Lord, or he's a scoundrel, and he's a liar, and I want nothing to do with him. And he starts with this sign. And he starts with this one because he says this is important, because this sign is who Jesus is. Jesus, in his first impression, is telling us something about the very nature of God, his kingdom, and what he's up to. So let's have a look. This is John chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. It will come up on the screen, but you might like to turn to it as well. John writes this. John chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. It says, on the 3rd day, a wedding took place in Cana, in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, they have no more wine. Dear woman, why do you involve me? Jesus replied, my time has not yet come. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, fill the jars with water. So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, now draw some out and take it to the master at the banquet. They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now. This, the first of his miraculous signs, Jesus performed at Cana in Galilee. He thus revealed his glory, and his disciples put their faith in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples, and there they stayed for a few days. Nice little mini break. Doesn't say that, but that's what they're doing. They're taking some time out. We're going to ask ourselves 3 questions. We're going to ask ourselves, what did Jesus do? Why did he do it? And how did he do it? And we're going to ask ourselves these because it can be so easy just to rush through this and miss the point. You know, the point is not that Jesus, they'd run out of wine, and so Jesus made wine and kept the party going. Jesus the lad with his keg, that kind of misses it. And for many, many years, I'd kind of until preparing this, I'd not really really in depth thought about it. You just think, isn't that nice of Jesus? But the point isn't that Jesus turns water into wine. The point is that Jesus turns shame into joy. I think you guys probably get it more than maybe we do coming from the UK. Your weddings are kind of a lot more. Our weddings in the UK tend to be like the celebration is a sit-down meal and a barn dance. You guys, you go for so much more. Like your weddings, start early in the morning, 9 o'clock normally. We're not even up for our wedding at that time. You then have the ceremony, more tea than you could ever imagine. You then got like a 10-course meal and karaoke. It's like, it's a lot bigger celebration. The same in the Middle East, but even more. Their weddings would have lasted for like a week. Everyone would have been invited. The whole village, the surrounding villages. Everyone you ever knew was there. Your relatives, your co-workers, everybody you'd ever encountered and mattered was there. And then can you hear the danger in these words? They have no more wine. Can you hear the shame in those words? This isn't just kind of a bad social faux pas. Okay, we'll pop down to the 7-Eleven and get some more wine. This is a disaster. It's a social disaster. You have invited everyone there. Hospitality is like the number 1 virtue, and you have run out of wine. There's no more surefire way to ruin a party than for the wine or for the food to run out. And this isn't just about the party. Wine in that culture, in ours it tends to kind of signify escapism. It signified life. This was about celebration. This was about joy. When he says they have no more wine, this is on your wedding day, on your first impression, as you start your new life together as a couple, you have no more joy. And you're not very hospitable. This is a social disaster. It's a dangerous disaster. People will have come from the surrounding regions. They've traveled far. It's a desert region. There was no refrigeration or filter system in those days. So the way you would purify water to make it safe to drink, you would pour like 1 part water for 1 part wine for 9 part water, and the alcohol would purify it. When you have no more wine, you no longer have no more way to quench your thirst. You've got 100 people in a place that is not built for that. This is a dangerous disaster. But worst of all, this is a shameful disaster. The groom would have been building up to this moment his entire year. He had a whole year to prepare for his wedding day. He had to build a house for his future wife to show that he could protect her and that he could provide for her, that he was good enough to take on a new family, to start a new family. He had to prepare and pay for the entire wedding. He would have spent the entire year getting ready for this moment. In many ways, he didn't spend his entire life getting ready for this day. This is a hard-working culture. There's not, parties don't come about. They work to the ground for their food, and at the last moment, at the last hurdle, he trips and falls because they have no more wine. This is every couple, every man's worst nightmare. This is every father-in-law. The big questions he's been asking all these years in preparation. Is this guy just smoke and mirrors? Or does he have any substance? His worst fears are confirmed this day. This guy can't plan. He's not going to be able to get a job. He's not going to be able to start a family and provide. Can you feel the shame in those words? They have no more wine. And maybe that's how you feel today. Maybe you've spent the last year investing in that relationship, investing in that business, your startup, or your children, or trying to have children. And at the end of it, all you have is that you have no more wine. You feel the shame. Now, here's what I would have done in that situation if I was the Messiah. And this is why we're all glad that I am not the Messiah. What I would have done is I'd have taken the young man aside and I'd taken him under my wing and explained to him and pointed out to him that you have no more wine, my friend. And then I'd have given him my top tips for party planning and project management and budgeting. I'd have regurgitated my second-hand Prince 2 project management training tips for him. And then I'd have explained to him how he could do better next time he is planning the biggest event of his life, which obviously is now ruined. That's what I'd have done. That's exactly what Jesus does not do. What Jesus does is he provides. He turns water into wine. He turns their shame into joy. He takes the worst thing that could ever happen to a couple on their wedding day and turns it into the best thing that probably ever happens in their entire life. He takes their emptiness and he fills it up with his fullness. This isn't just the wine that they needed. This is 180 gallons. This is not just what they needed, but this is an abundance. I don't care how many times you say yum sing. You're not going to get through this much wine. This is 2,000 glasses. They wouldn't have got through it all. This wouldn't have just kept the party going. This would have kept them going. This would have transformed the region. Cana would have become the Middle Eastern equivalent of Tuscany for the next few months. Jesus doesn't just give what they need. He gives an abundance and he turns their shame into joy. He makes them the most hospitable hosts that have ever hosted. He turns their wedding into a wedding that is talked about even to this day, which is every bride's dream. But why does he start here? Why does Jesus start with shame? Why is this his first impression? He starts with this because he says, this is what I am about. This is what I came to bring. I came to bring joy. Yes, there will be suffering. Yes, there will be denial, but those are just a means to an end, and the end is joy. He says, John starts his gospel with Jesus attending a wedding where the hosts mess it up. And he finishes the book of Revelation with Jesus hosting a wedding for everyone who messed up. This is all about joy. Charles Spurgeon, a few hundred years ago, wrote this. He said, some of us know what it is to be too happy to live. The love of God has been so overwhelmingly been experienced by us on some occasions that we almost had to ask God to stop the delight because we could endure it no more. For if God had not veiled his glory and love a bit more, we would have died for joy. That's a British guy speaking, he was impacted. And I don't want to say that this is every waking moment of the Christian's experience. This isn't the Christian experience in prayer every time, but it's possible and it's inevitable because Jesus came to bring joy. That is what is at the heart of God, and that is what his kingdom is about, and that is what he is up to in our lives. But why did he do it? And I suppose the simple answer is, he did it because the groom messed up. The groom had one job. He had one thing to do. He had 1 year to get ready for this day and make sure it all went well, and he messed it up. And I am that groom. We are that groom. We are that couple. We all mess up. We were looking at it at Alpha this past Tuesday, but we all, every person, every philosophy, every worldview has to come to terms with why it is that things seem like they shouldn't be. Why it is that there is brokenness in the world? Why is it that our hearts seem to be capable of producing such beauty and goodness and yet seem to contain so much darkness and brokenness? And there's only really two kind of answers. But we have to come up with a reason, and the Christian answer is that we sin, and that we are sinners, and that we need rescuing. And I don't know about you, but I shy away from that. I don't like to think of myself as needing rescuing. I react against that. But if we're honest, we all know that deep down. We all live out of that. Why do you work so hard? Why is it so important to look good? Why do we have to achieve? It's because deep down we know that we are not okay, and we are trying to purify and prove ourselves. In the film Chariots of Fire, one of the sprint runners says this: when the gun goes off, I have 10 seconds to justify my existence. We have to justify ourselves. We try and prove that we are okay, when deep down we know that we are not. And it's easy to kind of go, that's other people, but it's us. A really vivid kind of picture of this week. Wired magazine ran an article on one of the fastest growing tech industries at the moment. They reckon there's about 100,000 people employed, mostly out here in the East, in this industry at the moment. And that is people who are employed to moderate and filter the most violent, explicit and graphic content from our social media feeds to make sure that we don't come across things that we don't want to see. The moment humans seem to get anonymity, it seems to mean that we kind of have free rein to output everything from the darkest regions of our heart. One of the moderators was a woman called Maria, and she said this. So her job is just to sit there and look at things that have been flagged and just go yes or no. And she said, every day we see the proof of the infinite variety of human depravity. Talking about one video, she said, who could do something so cruel to somebody else? Speaking of the person doing it, he said, he was a bald man of Middle Eastern descent, but otherwise he was unremarkable. The face of evil was someone you might pass in the mall without a second glance. It's been said that human depravity is the most verifiable and empirically verifiable fact, yet the most intellectually resisted. In 1961, the Nazi trials were happening. Adolf Eichmann, who had been one of the kind of main architects of the Holocaust, was caught, and he was taken to Israel for trial. And they brought witnesses, people who'd been in the death camps, who had seen what he'd done, to testify against him. And one of the witnesses was Yehiel Denor. And when he took the stand, and he saw Adolf Eichmann, he collapsed in sobs. He just completely is destroyed. He falls out of the witness box and has to be kind of picked up by guards. He's just sobbing. The whole court is in pandemonium and they have to adjourn and come back later. After the trial was over and Adolf Eichmann convicted, Yehiel Denor was interviewed on a TV show. And they asked him, why did you react in that way? Was it that you were overcome with hatred for that man? Was it that you had post-traumatic stress? And Yehiel Denor said, no. He said, when I saw him, I realized that he was not a demon nor a superman, but a man, an ordinary man just like me. And I suddenly became terrified of myself because I became aware that I am capable of the very same things. We have two options with that. We can either go, yeah, the Nazis, they were other. We would never do something like that. They were subhuman. Kind of avoiding the irony that that's how the Nazis became Nazis, by seeing others as subhuman. Or we can say that I am like that too. That there are things in my heart that are not right. There are things in my heart that I don't even know about that are waiting to jump up and bite me. And Jesus comes to deal with that. But why start with shame? Why not guilt? Why not go to the cross first and then be resurrected? It'd be easier for people to believe in you after that. Why start here with shame? And I think it's this. Guilt says that I believe that what I have done is wrong. Shame says I believe that I am wrong. Jesus comes to deal with shame first, because shame is at the root and the result of everything that ruins our life. And he came that we might have life in all its fullness. Shame blocks us off from our relationship with God, because I can't come to him in prayer because what I looked at last night or what I did last week, or I can't come to him in prayer because I haven't been to him in prayer recently and I feel ashamed. Shame breaks our relationship with other people because we can't be honest about who we are because we are ashamed. It's not just relationships as well. Shame affects our work. Shame kills the ability to be vulnerable. And all the research is showing now that vulnerability is key to progressing in your work. Vulnerability is core to being creative. It's core to managing change. It's core to innovation. It is core to those three things that businesses and nations rise and fall on, and shame cuts them off at the root. Jesus comes to deal with shame because that is at the heart of what stops us having life in all its fullness in a relationship with him. Jesus comes to them in the moment where he could have said, "You have no more wine." And instead he says, "You are accepted." But how did he do it? And it's important to understand the how, because the how gives us the confidence to know that it is done. John's gospel is kind of like a treasure hunt. Everything is there for a purpose. There's clues, and it's all pointing to who Jesus is. And so as you go through the passage, everything that seems kind of like a throwaway comment is there to say something. And you see this. Jesus, they've run out of wine. There definitely would have been loads of wine vessels, loads of wine flasks all over the place. He could have said, "Go and fill those up, and I'll fill those up with wine." But instead, it says he sees 6 stone jars used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, and he says, "Fill those up." What Jesus is doing is he's saying these ceremonial jars, they represented the Old Testament law. And what the Old Testament law said is God is holy, he is other, and I am not. And I can't just walk in. I can't just walk in with my sin. I need to be ritually purified. And so they would wash themselves. And then there was the blood sacrifice, saying that our sin deserves a penalty, and that either I die or something dies in my place. In the Old Testament, it would often be a lamb that was killed. Jesus says, take those vessels that represent ritual purity, because he says you are no longer going to be ritually pure, but I'm going to make you actually pure. He's saying everything that Old Testament system related of you doing things in order to be good enough to come into my presence is fulfilled in me. I am replacing that. This is no longer about what you have done, what you do. This is about what I have done. In the moment, he could have turned to that couple and said, "You have no more wine." He turns and says, "Fill up those jars with water." In the moment, he could have looked on them in condemnation. He turns and he faces the cross. He says, "I am replacing all those things, all those lambs that died were just a sign and a symbol pointing to me when I on the cross will die as the one true lamb to pay your debt." And it can be hard to understand. Like, often people say to me, "Why doesn't God just forgive us? Why can't he just forgive?" And it's kind of like, imagine I lend you my iPhone, or you lend me your Samsung. And you've got my iPhone, and then you drop it, and it breaks. Now, one of two things can happen in that moment. Either you go, and you come to me and say, "I'm so sorry, I've broken your phone, I'd like to replace it." In that moment, one of two things can happen. Either I can go, "Yes, thank you very much, you did break my phone, you can go and buy me a new one." Or I can go, No, it's all right, I forgive you." But in that moment, two things have to happen. Either I have to go out and buy an iPhone, or I have to go without. Either way, someone pays. The debt doesn't just evaporate into thin air. The penalty has to be paid. You cannot forgive without loss, without sacrifice. And God says, I forgive you. And it's not because he doesn't love you. He loves you. But he is so holy that he had to come and die. But he is so loving that he was glad to. The gospel tells us that we are more sinful and more depraved than we ever dare believed. But that we are more loved and more accepted than we ever dared hope. So what is our response? What is John and Jesus trying to get out of us? Well, what our response is to believe that you are loved, and to believe that you are accepted, and to no longer try and relate to God by what you do, to try and purify yourself before you come to him. No thought, no prayer is unworthy of God. We come to Jesus just as we are, not because of what we do, but because what he has done. Knowing that what we do has been forgiven, and knowing that what we are is accepted. Knowing that he doesn't say, "You have no more wine," but he turned and filled up those jars and turned our water into wine. That he turned our shame into joy. And what is this for us as a community? What is it that we do as HTBB Church? What is it, the church role in this? Well, there's a little gem hidden in this, a kind of little dynamic of the kingdom, that the way discipleship, the way this life we're invited to live works. It's just there. Like Jesus, he could have just turned water into wine. He could have filled up the jars himself. But what he does is he turns to the servants and he says, "You go and fill them up." And the servants go and fill them up, and he turns their water into wine. And they are the first to perceive the miracle. If you want to see more of Jesus, if you want to get the inside track, serve others. Because in serving others, you will see Jesus at work, and you get to be involved in it too. It's pure grace. We can't turn water into wine, but he involves us. And then the other thing you'll notice is that, this is a bit of an effort for these servants. They're probably a bit tired. The party's been going on for a bit. And it's not like just, "I'll fill up those jars." Oh, great. These are big jars, 180 gallons. And it's not like they had a tap. They'd have had to go to the well, draw the water up, go up and fill them up. And remember, all this time, they're not seeing any fruit. They're just filling, "We've run out of wine. This is a great solution, Jesus. Brilliant idea. Fill these jars up with water. That's really going to satisfy people." And all this time, they're seeing no fruit. But they could have filled them halfway. They could have filled them most of the way. But it says here that they filled them to the brim. They filled them to the very most. There's a little meniscus, kind of, they're at the top. They're the most full they can be. And in doing so, Jesus is pouring out his grace. It's not in being obedient they caused him to pour out grace. Jesus is pouring out his grace. But in doing so in obedience, they make sure that there isn't just enough wine for the party to keep going on, but there is an abundance of wine. There is wine that affects the whole of that society because they are the first. They get the inside track. But by chapter 2 and 3, everyone in that region has heard about what Jesus has done in transforming this water to wine because there was an abundance. And the abundance was caught in the obedience. Obedience means your life is cup-shaped to catch as much of God's grace as he is pouring out. And so when Jesus asks you to do things that seem a bit odd, it's like, it seems like, Jesus, you're asking me to give up wine and fill my life with water instead. Trust him. Know that Jesus always turns water into wine, and not what might have seemed like wine in the past is nothing because he has saved the best till now. Our job is to know that we are loved and accepted, and as a community, we are obedient in service. And as we serve our colleagues, our communities, and our city, we will see the transformation of society. Because Jesus turns water into wine. He turns our shame into joy because he loves us and he invites us to come and drink.